Ever had your air conditioning break down in the middle of July? Now, imagine living in medieval times where the closest thing to cooling technology was a servant with a fancy fan. Medieval summers could pack quite a punch, especially in southern Europe where temperatures regularly soared to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the supposedly cooler regions like England and northern France weren't spared, with historical records showing some pretty brutal heat waves that would make modern weather forecasters raise their eyebrows. If you're wondering where all these sweaty medieval folks lived, here's a fun fact. About 90% of the population called the countryside home. Take London, for example. Despite being one of the biggest cities of its time, it only housed around 50,000 people by 1300. That's smaller than most modern suburban towns. Cities were crowded affairs, with buildings stacked so close together you could practically whisper to your neighbor through the walls. Speaking of homes, medieval living arrangements weren't exactly what you'd call spacious. City dwellers typically lived in narrow but tall houses, built upward instead of outward because street frontage was at a premium. These urban homes averaged around 400 square feet, about the size of a modern two-car garage. And if you think that's cramped, rural cottages were even tinier, usually between 200 to 300 square feet. Next time someone complains about their tiny apartment, remind them they're living in a medieval mansion by comparison. The type of home you lived in depended entirely on your social status, much like today's real estate market, minus the mortgage brokers and property taxes. At the bottom of the housing ladder were peasant cottages, usually just one room with a dirt floor and a smoky fireplace. Moving up the medieval property ladder, you'd find merchant houses that combine business and living space, kind of like today's live work lofts, just with more rats and fewer charging stations. At the top of the heap were manor houses, the medieval equivalent of luxury estates. These were sprawling stone structures with multiple rooms, each designed to take advantage of any available breeze. Some clever architectural features helped keep these places cool, but we'll get to those juicy details in the next section. The real kicker? None of these homes had anything resembling modern temperature control. No thermostats, no electric fans, not even a bag of ice from the corner store. Medieval folks had to rely on architectural ingenuity and age-old cooling techniques passed down through generations. And surprisingly, some of their methods were so effective that modern sustainable architects are taking notes. The most fascinating part? While we might pity our medieval ancestors for lacking modern comforts, they developed some remarkably clever ways to beat the heat. Their solutions ranged from simple tricks anyone could use to elaborate systems that would impress even today's engineers. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next, starting with how the medieval one-percenters kept their cool while everyone else was sweating it out. Money might not buy happiness, but in medieval times, it could definitely buy you a cooler summer. While the peasants were sweating it out in their humble cottages, the wealthy were living large in their stone mansions, complete with built-in cooling systems that would make modern architects take notes. These nobles didn't just stumble upon comfort, they engineered it with precision, even if they didn't have modern thermodynamics to guide them. Let's talk about those massive walls. We're not just talking about thick, we're talking absolutely unit-sized. Some castle and manor walls measured up to 4 feet thick. That's wider than most modern doorways. These weren't just for keeping out invaders, they acted like giant insulation blocks. During hot summer days, these thick stone walls absorbed heat, keeping the interior nice and cool. By night, they slowly released that heat, creating a natural temperature regulation system that worked 24/7. The most impressive part? These walls were so effective that some medieval castles still maintain comfortable temperatures today, even without modern climate control. The high ceilings in these fancy homes weren't just for showing off expensive tapestries. Rising up to 20 feet in some cases, these towering rooms used a simple principle: hot air rises. While the peasants baked in their low-ceiling cottages, the wealthy enjoyed their medieval version of air conditioning, with hot air floating way above their perfumed heads. Records show some great halls reached heights of 30 feet or more. Talk about having room to breathe. Windows in medieval mansions were an art form in themselves. Tall, narrow openings were strategically placed opposite each other, creating cross breezes that would make any modern real estate agent jealous. The deep window seats carved into those thick walls served a dual purpose. They were perfect reading nooks and natural cooling stations. These window seats often had small drainage channels carved into them to handle rain. which coincidentally made them excellent spots for catching cool breezes on hot days. Some clever nobles even had their windows fitted with thin alabaster screens that filtered harsh sunlight while allowing airflow. The floors weren't just for walking on either. Smooth stone or marble floors stayed naturally cool even during the hottest days. Walking barefoot on these floors was like finding the cool side of the pillow, times 100. Some clever nobles would have their servants dampen the floor slightly during extreme heat, creating a natural evaporative cooling effect. Wealthy homes often featured different types of stone flooring for different seasons. Darker stones for winter warmth and lighter, cooler stones for summer comfort. The gardens were where medieval cooling truly shined. These weren't your average backyard setups. They were carefully designed outdoor cooling systems disguised as pleasure grounds. Covered walkways, known as pergolas, were often draped with grapevines, providing shade and snacks, medieval multitasking at its finest. Large shade trees were strategically planted to block the sun's harshest rays, and fountains weren't just for show. The moving water created cool microclimates in their immediate vicinity. Some gardens even featured sunken sections that trapped cool air, creating natural air conditioning pockets. Speaking of water features, fountains and channels weren't just medieval bling. The wealthy had intricate systems of running water that cooled the air through evaporation. Some particularly fancy manors even had water-powered fans, though the servants probably weren't too thrilled about having to keep the water flowing. Archaeological evidence suggests some manor houses had complex water systems that could spray a fine mist in certain garden areas during particularly hot days. The piece de resistance, underground storage rooms. These cellars maintained a constant temperature of around 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, making them perfect for both food storage and cooling retreat. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of hanging out in the basement during a heat wave, just with more wine barrels and fewer video game consoles. Some of these cellars were massive, capable of storing enough food for hundreds of people and creating cool air that circulated throughout the house through cleverly designed shaft systems. All these cooling methods combined to create surprisingly comfortable living spaces, proving that medieval architects knew a thing or two about beating the heat. Meanwhile, the common folk had to get creative with their own cooling solutions, and they came up with some pretty ingenious methods that didn't require a royal budget. Let's dive into how the other 99% managed to keep their cool during those sweltering summer months. While the wealthy lounged in their stone mansions with fancy fountains, medieval peasants had to get creative with their cooling solutions. But don't feel too bad for them. These resourceful folks developed some surprisingly effective methods to beat the heat, and they did it without spending a single gold coin. The secret weapon in a peasant's cooling arsenal? Thatch roofing. These weren't just simple straw hats for houses, they were sophisticated insulation systems that would put some modern roofing to shame. A properly installed thatch roof could reach 12 to 14 inches thick, creating multiple air pockets that worked like prehistoric bubble wrap. The layered construction trapped cool air between sections, while the dense material kept the hot sun from penetrating through. Recent studies of surviving thatched cottages show these roofs could reduce indoor temperatures by up to 15 degrees compared to outdoor heat. Medieval peasants might not have had engineering degrees, but they were masters of natural ventilation. Their homes featured strategically placed doors and windows that created surprisingly effective airflow patterns. The real genius touch? The smoke hole in the roof, originally meant for letting out cooking fire smoke, doubled as a medieval exhaust fan. Hot air would rise and escape through this opening, pulling cooler air in through the doors and windows. A medieval peasant's version of a whole house fan, minus the electricity bill. The daily schedule of medieval peasants followed a pattern that modern productivity experts would probably charge good money to teach. Rising before dawn, they'd knock out the heavy field work while temperatures were still bearable. During the hottest part of the day, typically between noon and 3 p.m., they'd take a break that would make a Spanish siesta look amateur. This wasn't laziness. It was climate-smart working that maximized energy and minimized heat exposure. Tree planting around peasant cottages wasn't just for looks or fruit. It was part of a clever cooling strategy passed down through generations. Deciduous trees planted on the south side of homes provided perfect seasonal temperature control. Leafy shade in summer, but bare branches in winter allowed precious sunlight through. Talk about solar engineering without a calculator. Many peasants specifically chose fruit trees for this purpose, because if you're going to have a shade tree, it might as well make apples, right? Even their daily routines were carefully crafted around temperature management. Heavy work like threshing grain or chopping wood was scheduled for early morning or evening hours. Indoor tasks like repairing tools or spinning wool were saved for those scorching midday hours when working outside felt like being a human toast in a giant bread oven. Women often did their baking early in the morning, using the cool hours to prep food and avoiding heating up the house during peak temperatures. Medieval peasants also discovered that stone-paved areas near their homes could be a mixed blessing. While these surfaces absorbed heat during the day, making them pretty uncomfortable, they released that heat during cool evenings. Smart peasants would use these warm spots to dry herbs or linens after sunset, taking advantage of the stored thermal energy. It's the medieval version of a clothes dryer, just add a lot more patience. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and medieval peasants proved this with their creative cooling solutions. But staying cool wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival, especially when dealing with swarms of summer insects that seemed determined to make life miserable for everyone, rich or poor alike. And those bugs? They were about to meet their match in some surprisingly clever medieval pest control methods. Before window screens and bug zappers, summer months meant sharing your home with enough flying house guests to form their own tiny kingdom. Medieval pest control was like an endless game of chess, except the opposing pieces had wings and a taste for human blood. The best part? These battles happened every single summer, making pest control a crucial part of medieval survival skills. Mosquitoes were public enemy number one. These whining vampires weren't just annoying, they were everywhere. Historical records from medieval monasteries describe swarms so thick they darkened the air like storm clouds. One particularly detailed account from a 13th century English monastery complained about mosquitoes so numerous they could drain a man dry faster than the king's tax collectors. And without mosquito repellent or screened windows, people had to get creative. The wealthy solved this problem by having servants wave large fans all night, which probably explains why fan bearer was actually a job title in some noble households. Must have been a real hit at medieval career fairs. But medieval people weren't completely defenseless. They discovered that certain plants acted as natural bug repellents. Lavender, rosemary, and artemisia were the medieval equivalent of off spray. These herbs were planted strategically around doors and windows, creating natural barrier zones that insects preferred to avoid. The really clever part? Many of these plants also had medicinal or culinary uses, making them the Swiss Army knife of medieval gardening. Some monasteries maintained extensive herb gardens that served triple duty, repelling insects, seasoning food, and treating various ailments. Smoke was another weapon in the war against insects. Medieval homes would burn specific types of woods and herbs during evening hours, creating a protective, smoky barrier. Cedar was particularly popular because it smelled nice to humans but sent bugs packing. Some folks would even add certain herbs to their cooking fires, turning dinner prep into pest control. It's like those citronella candles we use today, just with more actual cooking involved. Historical documents show that some communities even developed specific smoke-based rituals for the start of mosquito season. The medieval secret weapon against insects? Animals. Keeping chickens around wasn't just for eggs. These feathered friends were excellent at controlling ground-based insects. One chicken could eat several thousand insects per day, making them medieval pest control champions. Bats were surprisingly welcome guests in many areas, with some monasteries even building special bat roosts in their gardens. Medieval Europeans might not have understood echolocation, but they definitely understood that one bat could eat thousands of mosquitoes per night. Some communities even encouraged swallows to nest near their homes, creating nature's own aerial insect defense system. Inside their homes, people hung bundles of dried herbs from ceiling beams. These herbs served double duty. They helped repel insects while also being handy for cooking. Popular choices included bay leaves, mint, and tansy. The bundles were replaced regularly to maintain their effectiveness, creating a medieval version of those little tree-shaped car air fresheners, just with actual pest control benefits. In larger homes, these herb bundles could be found in almost every room, creating an early form of whole-house pest control. One particularly clever trick involved using specific types of wood smoke for food storage areas. Certain hardwoods, when burned, produced smoke that not only drove away flying insects, but also helped preserve food. Oak and beech were particular favorites, with their smoke providing protection that could last for weeks. This method was so effective that some of these smoking techniques are still used in traditional food preservation today. The medieval folk might not have understood the chemistry behind it, but they knew it worked. Rural communities often planted specific types of flowers known to repel insects around their vegetable gardens and home perimeters. Marigolds, chrysanthemums, and pyrethrum daisies form beautiful but deadly to insects barriers. These same plants are still used today in making natural insecticides. Turns out medieval gardeners were onto something. Some communities even held annual planting festivals to ensure these protective gardens were properly maintained. As summer temperatures rose and insects multiplied, the battle against bugs became intertwined with another challenge: staying comfortable in heavy medieval clothing. From peasants' rough linens to knights' metal armor, medieval fashion posed its own unique cooling challenges, and people developed some surprising solutions for dealing with both the heat and their wardrobes. Getting dressed in medieval summers was like playing a high-stakes game of what's the least amount of clothing I can wear without scandalizing the local priest? The answer varied dramatically depending on your social status, with nobles and peasants taking very different approaches to summer fashion. Medieval clothing wasn't just about looking good, it was a complex balance of social status, practicality, and not passing out from heat exhaustion. Noble clothing was all about layers, because apparently medieval rich people didn't get the memo about less being more. The wealthy wore fine linen undergarments beneath outer layers of silk, often in lighter colors that reflected sunlight. These fancy fabrics weren't just about showing off. Silk actually helps regulate body temperature, while linen excellently wicks away sweat. A noble's summer wardrobe could cost as much as a peasant's house, which seems a bit excessive just to avoid pit stains. Historical records show that some nobles owned clothing worth more than their servants would earn in 10 years. Talk about fashion inflation. Peasants, on the other hand, kept things much simpler. Their summer outfits consisted of basic linen or lightweight wool garments, usually undyed and loose-fitting. These clothes might have looked plain, but they were surprisingly practical. The loose fit allowed air to circulate while the natural fibers absorbed sweat and dried quickly. A peasant's entire wardrobe might only contain 2 or 3 outfits, but they were built to handle everything from field work to village festivals. Some clever peasants would even dampen their clothes slightly during extreme heat, creating a primitive form of evaporative cooling. But knights, they had it worst of all. Wearing full armor in summer was like being a human baked potato wrapped in tin foil. A complete suit of armor could weigh between 40 to 65 pounds. That's like carrying a third grader around all day in the blazing sun. To prevent cooking inside their metal shells, knights wore special padded garments called gambesons underneath. These thick quilted undershirts were designed to absorb sweat and provide cushioning. Records from medieval tournaments mention knights losing up to 5 pounds of water weight during summer events, giving new meaning to the term hot under the collar. Some tournaments even had special rest periods just for knights to cool down and avoid heat exhaustion. The undergarment game was surprisingly sophisticated. Linen was the medieval equivalent of modern performance fabric, prized for its ability to wick away moisture. Nobles might wear multiple layers of increasingly fine linen, while peasants made do with a single layer. Some particularly fancy nobles even had their linen garments scented with herbs, medieval deodorant at its finest. The finest linen was so valuable that it would be listed specifically in noble wills, passed down like family jewels. Head coverings weren't just fashion statements, they were essential summer survival gear. Peasants working in fields wore wide-brimmed straw hats that would make modern sun hats look dainty in comparison. These hats were so effective that similar designs are still used by farmers today. Noble women favored veils and lightweight caps, while men wore various styles of caps and hats depending on their social status. One 14th century fashion guide advised wealthy women to wear pale silk veils in summer, lest the sun turn you common looking. Medieval shade throwing at its finest. Even shoes got the summer treatment. While peasants might go barefoot during the hottest months, free air conditioning for the feet, nobles wore lightweight leather shoes or slippers indoors. Some particularly fancy folks had special summer shoes made with tiny ventilation holes. Medieval Crocs, if you will, just with less plastic and more class. The wealthiest might even have different shoes for morning and afternoon wear, changing as the ground temperature heated up. The real fashion victims, though, were the clergy. Try wearing multiple layers of heavy black robes in the summer heat while maintaining your dignity. No wonder medieval priests seem so cranky in historical records. Some church documents even include debates about whether it was acceptable to lighten up the dress code during extreme heat waves. Spoiler alert, the answer was usually no. One particularly amusing record from a French monastery complains about monks falling asleep during summer services due to their heavy robes. Apparently, even divine devotion was no match for heat exhaustion. All this effort to stay fashionably cool while avoiding sunburn led to some creative solutions for sun protection. And when it came to medieval sunscreen, well, that's where things got really interesting. The lengths people would go to protect their skin would make modern dermatologists either applaud or cringe in horror. Before sunscreen came in convenient bottles with SPF ratings, medieval folks had to get creative with sun protection, and boy, did they ever. The most famous medieval sunscreen recipe comes from a fascinating medical text called the Trotula, written by a female physician named Trotta in 12th century Italy. Her recipe reads like a medieval chemistry experiment gone wild. Mix lily root, white lead, mastic, frankincense, camphor, and lard. Then top it off with rose water. Not exactly something you'd find at your local pharmacy. Let's talk about that white lead for a minute. Medieval beauty standards were apparently worth risking a little casual poison for. White lead was basically the medieval equivalent of modern zinc oxide sunscreen, except it could kill you. The truly mind-boggling part? People knew it was dangerous but used it anyway. One medieval writer noted that it makes the face white but shortens life, a side effect modern sunscreen manufacturers wisely avoid mentioning on their labels. Common folk, blessed with both better sense and less money, stuck to more practical sun protection methods. Wide-brimmed straw hats were the go-to choice for field workers, paired with long sleeves and whatever other clothing they could reasonably wear while still being able to move. These simple solutions might not have been glamorous, but they kept people from turning into medieval lobsters. Treating sunburn was its own adventure. The common folk had some surprisingly effective remedies: egg whites mixed with rose water, aloe vera, yes, they had that back then, and various herbal poultices. One particularly popular treatment involved cucumber juice mixed with vinegar. Not too far off from modern after-sun lotions, minus the artificial green coloring and fancy packaging. Working hours were carefully planned around sun exposure. Most outdoor work happened in the early morning or late afternoon, with indoor tasks saved for those brutal midday hours. This wasn't just about avoiding sunburn, it was about survival. Medieval medical texts record cases of severe sunstroke, particularly among farmers and construction workers. One account describes a stonemason who worked through midday heat and burned so fierce his mind wandered for 3 days. Medieval OSHA would not have approved. The cultural attitudes toward sun exposure were fascinating. Tan skin was associated with peasant work, making pale skin a status symbol among the wealthy. This led to some truly bizarre sun-avoiding behaviors among nobles. Women would wear thick veils and gloves even in the hottest weather, and some nobles would only venture outside under canopies carried by servants. Medieval dermatologists would have made a fortune if they'd existed. The most practical sun protection came from architecture itself. Covered walkways, deep doorways, and overhanging eaves weren't just for show. They created shadows that people could navigate through like medieval ninjas avoiding the sun. Town markets often had canvas awnings stretched over the busiest areas, creating shaded shopping zones that would make modern mall designers nod in approval. Perhaps the most effective medieval sunscreen was simply staying inside during peak hours. This wasn't laziness. It was a well-understood survival strategy passed down through generations. The wealthy had their cool stone manors, while peasants retreated to the shade of trees or the relative cool of their cottages. As one medieval writer put it, only mad dogs and Englishmen venture out in the midday sun. Though that quote might be from a bit later, the sentiment was certainly alive and well in medieval times. When you consider all these methods together, from the questionable chemical concoctions of the wealthy to the practical solutions of the common folk, medieval sun protection was a remarkable mix of ingenuity, superstition, and common sense. They might not have understood UV rays or SPF ratings, but they certainly knew how to avoid getting burned, both literally and figuratively.